Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back almost 2,000 years to the heart of ancient Rome, a world filled with grand temples, powerful armies, busy marketplaces, and emperors whose decisions sometimes left an entire empire completely confused. So, get comfortable, relax, and let the story unfold. Our journey begins with a young boy named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but almost no one remembers him by that name. Instead, history knows him as Caligula, a nickname that meant little boots. As a child, Caligula often traveled with his father, the famous Roman general Germanicus. The soldiers adored the little boy and even dressed him in a tiny military uniform with miniature leather boots. Those boots were called Caligae in Latin, so the soldiers affectionately called him Caligula. It was a cute nickname for a child, although perhaps not the most intimidating title for a future emperor. But Caligula's childhood was far from peaceful. His father died when he was still very young, and many Romans believed he had been poisoned, though no one could ever prove it. Soon afterward, several members of Caligula's family were arrested, exiled, or mysteriously disappeared from public life. Growing up inside the imperial family meant learning one important lesson very early: trust no one. A friendly smile could hide dangerous intentions, and saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could destroy an entire family. Later, Caligula was sent to live with the aging emperor Tiberius on the island of Capri. There, he learned to hide his true feelings and carefully watch everyone around him. In Rome, survival often depended on staying quiet. Then, in AD 37, everything changed. When Tiberius died, 24-year-old Caligula became the new emperor of Rome. The city erupted in celebration. People filled the streets cheering for the son of the beloved general Germanicus. Caligula began his reign with gifts to the people, bringing back political exiles and organizing grand public games. For a short time, he seemed like the perfect ruler. But history had a very different story waiting. Only a few months after becoming emperor, Caligula became seriously ill. Ancient writers never agreed on what caused the illness, but many believed that after he recovered, something inside him had changed. The cheerful young emperor slowly became suspicious, unpredictable, and increasingly convinced that everyone around him was plotting against him. And that was only the beginning, because in the next chapter, we'll see how unlimited power slowly transformed Rome's promising young emperor into one of history's most infamous rulers. At first, everything seemed perfect. The people cheered for their young emperor, hoping he would restore the greatness of Rome. After the cautious rule of Tiberius, Caligula appeared energetic, generous, and full of promise. But as the months passed, that promise slowly began to disappear. Caligula no longer seemed satisfied with simply ruling the empire. He wanted everyone to admire him, fear him, and remember that his power had no limits. Public festivals became grander than ever before. Gladiator games lasted for days. Musicians entertained enormous crowds, and expensive feasts filled the imperial palace. Rare animals arrived from distant provinces, and every celebration was designed to be bigger than the last. Of course, such luxury came with an enormous price. The money carefully saved by previous emperors quickly disappeared. To replace it, taxes increased. Wealthy citizens lost their property, and many powerful Romans suddenly found themselves accused of crimes. Once the emperor claimed their wealth, there was almost nothing anyone could do. Ancient historians also describe Caligula as someone completely fascinated with luxury. His clothes were decorated with precious jewels, and his banquets featured the rarest foods from across the empire. One famous story even claims he dissolved a valuable pearl in vinegar and drank it, simply to prove that he could waste a fortune in a single moment. Whether that story is entirely true remains uncertain. Roman writers often enjoyed making their stories more dramatic. Even so, nearly every ancient source agrees on one thing. Caligula became obsessed with displaying unlimited wealth and unlimited power. The Roman Senate suffered as well. Men who had once believed themselves to be the most important people in Rome now discovered that the emperor enjoyed embarrassing them whenever he wished. Their titles meant little if Caligula decided otherwise. Inside the palace, fear slowly replaced loyalty. Every conversation became cautious. Every smile became forced. No one could predict whether the emperor would reward someone with riches or destroy their life without warning. The young ruler who had once inspired so much hope was becoming someone entirely different, and soon the stories surrounding his reign would grow even stranger than anyone could have imagined. As Caligula's confidence continued to grow, so did his belief that he was unlike any ordinary ruler. He didn't just want people to obey him, he wanted them to worship him. Ancient historians describe him appearing in public dressed as different Roman gods. Sometimes he wore the symbols of Jupiter, the king of the gods. Other times he dressed as Hercules or Apollo, enjoying the shocked expressions of those around him. Whether every detail is true is impossible to know, but there is little doubt that Caligula loved turning himself into the center of every spectacle. Many Romans found this deeply unsettling. In Roman tradition, emperors could be honored after their deaths, but claiming divine status while still alive was something entirely different. Even those closest to the emperor rarely dared question him. Instead, they applauded, smiled, and pretended everything was perfectly normal. Fear had become more powerful than honesty. Caligula also demanded constant praise. Whenever he entered a room, everyone was expected to stand, bow, and admire him. A simple mistake or even an expression he disliked could be enough to ruin someone's future. Life inside the imperial palace became exhausting. Courtiers carefully chose every word they spoke. Senators avoided eye contact unless invited to look directly at the emperor. Even wealthy nobles worried that a single careless comment might cost them everything they owned. Then came one of the strangest stories ever told about ancient Rome. Caligula owned a magnificent horse named Incitus. The animal lived a life that most Romans could only dream of. Ancient writers claimed the horse slept in marble stables, ate from golden feeding bowls, and wore expensive purple blankets reserved for the highest ranks of society. Some historians even wrote that Caligula planned to make Incitus a Roman consul, one of the empire's highest political offices. Did he truly intend to appoint his horse to such an important position? Historians still argue about that question today. Some believe the story was exaggerated by writers who hated Caligula. Others think the emperor made the joke deliberately, simply to insult the Senate by suggesting that even his horse could perform their duties just as well. Whatever the truth may be, the story survived for nearly 2,000 years for one simple reason. People believed Caligula was capable of doing something that unbelievable. And as his behavior became more unpredictable, the fear inside Rome continued to grow. The empire that had once celebrated its young emperor was beginning to wonder how much longer it could survive under a ruler who seemed to believe that nothing and no one was beyond his power. As the years passed, Rome became a city where silence often felt safer than speaking. Caligula trusted fewer people with each passing month. Friends, advisors, and even members of his own family began living in constant fear, never knowing who might fall out of the emperor's favor next. Ancient historians describe a palace filled with suspicion. A simple rumor could destroy a person's life overnight. If Caligula believed someone was plotting against him, that alone could be enough to order an arrest. In many cases, there was no trial, no chance to defend yourself, and no way to appeal the emperor's decision. The Senate had become little more than an audience. Meetings that were once meant to discuss the future of the empire now often turned into opportunities for Caligula to remind everyone who held absolute power. Some senators laughed at jokes they didn't find funny. Others applauded speeches they didn't agree with. They weren't showing respect. They were trying to survive. Meanwhile, life outside the palace was becoming more difficult as well. The enormous cost of Caligula's games, celebrations, and building projects continued to drain the empire's finances. To recover more money, wealthy citizens were heavily taxed, and valuable estates were often seized by the government. Many Romans still enjoyed the public entertainment, but behind closed doors, conversations became quieter. People whispered instead of speaking openly. No one wanted to be accused of criticizing the emperor. History shows us that fear can spread through a society without a single battle being fought. It grows little by little until ordinary people begin censoring themselves without even anyone asking them to. That seems to have been the atmosphere in Rome during the final years of Caligula's reign. Yet the emperor appeared completely confident. He believed no one would ever dare challenge him. Surrounded by guards, wealth, and absolute authority, he seemed convinced that his position was untouchable. But history has a habit of surprising rulers who believe they can never fall. Far from the grand halls of the palace, a small group of powerful men had already begun asking a dangerous question. If no one could stop the emperor, who would? By the beginning of AD 41, the atmosphere in Rome had changed completely. The excitement that had greeted Caligula's rise to power was gone. In its place stood fear, uncertainty, and growing anger. Many senators felt humiliated, wealthy citizens worried about losing everything they owned, and even some members of the emperor's own guard had begun to lose their loyalty. Among them was a senior officer of the Praetorian Guard named Cassius Correa. Ancient historians say Caligula often mocked Correa in public, making cruel jokes and treating him with little respect. Whether these stories are completely accurate is impossible to know, but they appear in several ancient accounts. Eventually, a conspiracy began to take shape. A small group of senators, officials, and Praetorian officers secretly agreed that the emperor had become too dangerous to remain on the throne. Planning such an act was incredibly risky. If the plot were discovered, every person involved would almost certainly be executed. Yet they decided to continue. On January 24, AD 41, Caligula attended public games in Rome. As he walked through a passageway beneath the imperial palace, away from the cheering crowds, the conspirators made their move. The attack happened quickly. Ancient sources describe several guards surrounding the emperor before striking him repeatedly. Within moments, the man who had ruled the greatest empire in the Western world was dead at only 28 years old. The violence did not end there. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, was also killed, and their young daughter was murdered shortly afterward. By modern standards, it was a horrifying and deeply tragic end to an entire family. For a short time, confusion spread across Rome. Some people believed the emperor was still alive. Others feared that civil war was about to begin. The Senate briefly discussed restoring the old Roman Republic, ending the rule of emperors forever. But events moved too quickly. Hidden inside the imperial palace was Caligula's uncle, Claudius. According to the ancient story, frightened by the chaos, he hid behind a curtain until members of the Praetorian Guard discovered him. Instead of killing him, they declared him the new emperor. Just like that, Rome had another ruler. Caligula's reign had lasted less than 4 years, yet his name would survive for nearly 2,000 years as a symbol of absolute power, excess, and the dangers of a ruler who believed no one could stand in his way.
Caligula was gone, but the stories about him were only beginning. After his death, Rome quickly tried to erase many traces of his reign. Some statues were destroyed, his name was removed from public monuments, and the new emperor, Claudius, worked hard to restore stability to an empire that had spent years living in fear. But memories are much harder to erase than stone. Ancient historians wrote page after page about Caligula's strange behavior. Some described him as a cruel tyrant. Others focused on the unbelievable stories that surrounded his life. Over time, those stories spread far beyond Rome, turning Caligula into one of the most infamous rulers in history. The challenge for modern historians is that many of these accounts were written after his death by authors who strongly disliked him. That doesn't mean they were lying, but it does mean we should read their work carefully. Some stories were probably true. Others may have been exaggerated to make the fallen emperor appear even more outrageous. That is one of the most fascinating parts of studying ancient history. The truth is often hidden somewhere between the facts and the legends. What we do know is that Caligula ruled for less than 4 years, yet his name became far more famous than many emperors who ruled for decades. Even today, people use his story as a warning about what can happen when one person holds unlimited power without anyone willing or able to challenge them. His life also reminds us that history is rarely simple. Was Caligula born cruel? Did illness change his personality? Did years of fear and political violence leave deep emotional scars that shaped the ruler he became? No one can answer those questions with complete certainty. Nearly 2,000 years later, the evidence is incomplete, and the people who knew the truth are long gone. Yet that mystery is exactly why his story continues to fascinate us, because behind every famous legend was once a real human being, a child called Little Boots, who grew up inside one of the most powerful families in the world, became emperor at just 24 years old, and left behind a legacy that historians are still debating today. The Roman Empire would continue for centuries after Caligula's death, producing brilliant rulers, terrible rulers, and everything in between. But few names have echoed through history quite as loudly as the young emperor whose reign proved that absolute power can sometimes create unforgettable legends and unforgettable warnings.
For centuries, one question has continued to puzzle historians. Was Caligula truly insane? Or was he simply one of the most misunderstood rulers in Roman history? The truth is far more complicated than it first appears. Much of what we know about Caligula comes from ancient writers such as Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus. They wrote years after his death, relying on stories, official records, and the memories of people who had lived through his reign. While these historians are incredibly valuable, they were not completely neutral.
Most of them had little sympathy for Caligula, and that may have influenced the way they described him. Modern historians, therefore, approach these accounts with caution. For example, the famous story about Caligula making his horse a consul may never have happened exactly as it is often told. Some scholars believe it was actually a sarcastic joke meant to insult the Roman Senate. By suggesting that even his horse could do their job, Caligula may have been mocking the politicians he despised. Another mystery surrounds the serious illness he suffered early in his reign. Some researchers believe that illness may have affected his brain or personality. Others think years of childhood trauma, constant political danger, and the pressure of ruling the world's largest empire gradually changed his behavior. Of course, no doctor can examine someone who lived 2,000 years ago, so no diagnosis can ever be certain. What history does tell us is that absolute power can change almost anyone. When no one dares to disagree with a ruler, even ordinary decisions can become reckless. Over time, confidence can turn into arrogance, and arrogance can become something far more dangerous. That lesson is not limited to ancient Rome. It has appeared throughout history in kingdoms, empires, and even modern governments. Perhaps that is why Caligula's story still feels surprisingly familiar today. Whether he was truly mad, seriously ill, or simply corrupted by unlimited power, his reign remains one of history's greatest warnings. Because sometimes the most fascinating stories are not about how an empire rises. They're about how quickly everything can begin to fall apart when no one is left to say, enough.
Caligula ruled Rome for less than 4 years. Compared to many Roman emperors, that was a remarkably short reign. Yet somehow his name became more famous than rulers who governed the empire for decades. That alone tells us something important. History doesn't always remember the longest reigns. Sometimes it remembers the most extraordinary ones. Over the centuries, Caligula has appeared in countless books, paintings, documentaries, television series, and films. His name has become almost synonymous with madness, cruelty, and the dangers of unlimited power. But behind the legend was a real person whose life began with hope and ended in tragedy. He was once a cheerful little boy walking beside Roman soldiers, a child admired by an entire army, a young man welcomed into Rome as the emperor everyone believed would restore the empire's glory. And then, somewhere along the way, everything changed. Whether that change came from illness, trauma, fear, ambition, or simply the corrupting influence of absolute power is something we may never know with complete certainty. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between all of those possibilities. That uncertainty is what makes history so fascinating. Unlike stories and novels, history rarely gives us perfect heroes or perfect villains. Real people are far more complicated. They make brilliant decisions one day and terrible mistakes the next. They are shaped by the world around them just as much as they shape it. Caligula's story reminds us that power without limits can be incredibly dangerous. When one person controls an empire and no one dares to challenge their decisions, even the strongest nation can begin to lose its way. The Roman Empire survived long after Caligula was gone, but his reign became one of its darkest and most unforgettable chapters. Nearly 2,000 years later, people still argue about who he really was. A monster? A misunderstood ruler? Or simply a young emperor placed in a position that no human being was ever truly prepared to handle? Whatever the answer may be, one thing is certain. The boy once known as Little Boots became one of the most unforgettable emperors in the history of Rome, leaving behind a story that continues to captivate the world to this very day. As our journey through the life of Caligula comes to an end, it's worth remembering that history is rarely black and white. Ancient Rome was a world where power could make a man a hero one day and a villain the next. Every emperor lived under enormous pressure, surrounded by political rivals, ambitious generals, and advisors whose loyalty could change overnight. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, yet it left a mark that has survived for nearly 20 centuries. Some of the stories told about him were almost certainly true. Others were probably exaggerated over time,
and a few may have become legends that grew larger with every generation that repeated them. But perhaps that doesn't make his story any less meaningful, because history is not only about discovering exactly what happened. It is also about understanding why people remembered certain events the way they did. Caligula became a symbol, a warning about what can happen when fear replaces wisdom, when pride grows stronger than reason, and when unlimited power is placed in the hands of a single person. His rise reminds us how quickly hope can capture a nation. His fall reminds us how quickly that hope can disappear. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that no throne, no palace, and no empire lasts forever. Every ruler eventually becomes part of history. Only their choices remain. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through one of ancient Rome's most fascinating stories. Now, as the marble temples fade into the distance and the echoes of the Roman legions slowly disappear into history, it's time to let this story come to rest. Close your eyes, relax, and let the ancient world drift gently away. Because somewhere beneath the ruins of Rome, the story of the boy once called Little Boots still whispers through history, reminding us that even the most powerful emperor could never escape the passage of time. The streets of ancient Rome are quiet now. The cheering crowds have long disappeared. The marble palaces that once displayed imaginable wealth have become silent ruins, standing beneath the same sky that watched emperors rise and fall nearly 2,000 years ago. Caligula's story may have ended, but the Roman Empire continued for centuries. New emperors came to power. Some ruled with wisdom, others with cruelty, and many were remembered for something in between. Each believed in their own way that their rule would shape history forever. Some did, many did not. That is one of history's greatest lessons. Power is temporary. Fame is temporary. Even the mightiest empire the world had ever seen could not stop the passage of time. Today, millions of people still visit the ruins of Rome. They walk through the remains of ancient forums, stand beneath towering columns, and imagine what life must have been like when emperors commanded armies that stretched across 3 continents. Yet among all those names carved into history, Caligula remains one of the most unforgettable. Not because he ruled the longest, not because he won the greatest battles, but because his life became a reminder of how quickly unlimited power can change a person, and how fragile even the strongest throne can be. History never truly gives us all the answers. Instead, it leaves us with questions. Who was Caligula behind the stories? How much was fact, and how much became legend? Perhaps we will never know. And maybe that mystery is exactly why people continue telling his story after nearly 20 centuries. As our journey through ancient Rome comes to an end, imagine the sun slowly setting over the city. The sound of marching soldiers fades into the distance. The marketplaces grow quiet. The great temples cast long shadows across empty streets. The empire rests. The story is complete. And somewhere in the silence of history, the boy once known as Little Boots becomes a legend once again. Thank you for spending this time exploring the strange, fascinating, and unforgettable world of ancient Rome.
The death of Caligula marked the end of one extraordinary chapter, but it did not bring an end to the Roman Empire. In fact, Rome had faced crises before, and it would face many more in the centuries ahead. One emperor could fall, yet the empire itself continued moving forward, supported by its armies, its laws, and millions of people spread across 3 continents. The man chosen to replace Caligula was his uncle, Claudius. At first, many people underestimated him. He had spent much of his life away from politics, and few believed he possessed the strength to rule such a vast empire. But history often enjoys surprising us. Claudius proved to be a far more capable emperor than many expected. He reorganized parts of the government, improved the empire's administration, and expanded Roman territory by beginning the conquest of Britain. After the uncertainty of Caligula's reign, many Romans welcomed a ruler who preferred careful planning over dramatic displays. Yet the memory of Caligula never truly disappeared. Parents told stories about him, writers continued debating his actions. Generations of Romans grew up hearing tales of the emperor who seemed to believe there were no limits to his power. Whether every story was true mattered less than the lesson people believed it taught. The empire had survived because no ruler, no matter how powerful, was greater than Rome itself. That idea would be tested again and again throughout Roman history. Some future emperors would become wise leaders, others would make mistakes just as dramatic as Caligula's, and each new generation would discover that ruling the greatest empire in the ancient world was never as simple as wearing a crown or sitting upon a throne. For Rome, the story was far from over. The legacy of the Roman emperors. Caligula's story may have come to an end, but the age of the Roman emperors was only just beginning. Over the next several centuries, Rome would be ruled by dozens of emperors, each leaving behind a different legacy. Some became wise reformers who strengthened the empire. Others became famous generals who expanded Rome's borders farther than ever before. And a few earned a reputation for cruelty, ambition, or decisions that still puzzle historians today. The Roman Empire survived because it was larger than any single ruler. Its roads connected distant provinces across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its laws influenced generations of legal systems, and its cities became centers of trade, culture, and learning. Even when emperors came and went, Rome itself continued to shape the ancient world. Perhaps that is why people remain fascinated by Roman history. It is not simply a collection of battles or political events. It is the story of real people making difficult choices, sometimes brilliant and sometimes disastrous, while trying to govern one of the greatest civilizations ever created. Caligula reminds us how dangerous unlimited power can become. Claudius reminds us that underestimated leaders can sometimes achieve remarkable success. And the emperors who followed would each add another chapter to a story that lasted for hundreds of years. Today, when we walk through the ruins of ancient Rome or read the words of historians who lived long ago, we are not just studying the past. We are listening to the echoes of an empire that helped shape the modern world. Its marble temples may have crumbled, its mighty legions may have disappeared, but the lessons of Rome continue to live on. And perhaps that is the greatest reason why, after nearly 2,000 years, the Roman Empire still captures our imagination, quietly reminding us that every civilization, no matter how powerful, leaves behind stories that future generations will never stop telling. The empire that refused to be forgotten. Long after Caligula, Claudius, and countless other emperors had disappeared into history, the Roman Empire continued to leave its mark on the world. Its influence reached far beyond its own borders. Roman engineers built roads so well that some of their routes are still followed today. Massive stone bridges carried travelers across rivers, and impressive aqueducts brought fresh water to crowded cities. These were not just remarkable achievements for the ancient world, they became examples that later civilizations admired and learned from. The Romans also believed that laws should be written down and organized. While modern legal systems are very different, many ideas about courts, citizenship, and government were influenced by principles first developed in ancient Rome. Even language carries Rome's legacy. Latin, the language spoken by the Romans, eventually gave birth to Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Thousands of English words also have Latin roots, meaning that without realizing it, many of us use pieces of the Roman world every single day.
Yet perhaps Rome's greatest legacy is not found in stone buildings or ancient documents. It is found in its stories. The triumphs of great generals, the wisdom of thoughtful rulers, the mistakes of ambitious emperors, and the unforgettable tale of a young man called Little Boots, whose short reign became one of the most discussed chapters in Roman history. History has a remarkable way of keeping certain names alive, not because those people were perfect, but because their lives teach lessons that never seem to grow old. And that is why, nearly 2,000 years later, the story of Rome continues to inspire historians, writers, travelers, and curious minds around the world. The empire may have fallen.
One last walk through ancient Rome. Before we leave ancient Rome behind, imagine taking one final walk through its streets. The morning sun rises over the marble temples, casting long shadows across the forum. Merchants are opening their shops, bakers are pulling fresh bread from their ovens, and citizens are beginning another ordinary day in what was once the greatest city on earth. Somewhere in the distance, soldiers march in perfect formation, their armor catching the first light of the morning. Government officials hurry toward the Senate House, while children run through the crowded streets, completely unaware that they are living in a city whose story will be remembered for thousands of years. For most Romans, life was surprisingly ordinary. They worked, they raised families, they worried about money, they celebrated festivals, and just like people today, they wondered what the future might bring. Yet above them all stood the emperor, a single man whose decisions could change the lives of millions. Sometimes those decisions brought peace and prosperity. Other times they brought fear and uncertainty. Caligula's reign became one of those moments when the future of Rome seemed impossible to predict. His story reminds us that even the strongest empire could be shaken by the actions of one ruler. But Rome was stronger than any individual. It survived political crises, civil wars, and difficult emperors because its foundations reached far beyond the palace walls. That may be the greatest lesson of all. Civilizations are not built by one person. They are built by countless ordinary people whose names history often forgets. The farmers who grew the food, the builders who raised the temples, the soldiers who defended the borders, the merchants who kept trade moving across the empire. Together, they created a civilization that continues to fascinate the world nearly 2,000 years later. History never truly sleeps. As our journey finally comes to an end, the city of Rome slowly fades into silence. The crowds disappear. The soldiers lower their banners. The grand palaces and towering temples become quiet memories, standing beneath the same sky that has watched centuries pass by. Caligula is long gone. So are the senators who feared him, the soldiers who protected him, and the ordinary citizens who watched his rise and fall unfold before their eyes. Only history remains. When we read about ancient Rome, it is easy to focus on emperors, battles, and political drama. But behind every famous name were millions of ordinary people simply trying to live their lives. They worked in busy markets, harvested crops in the countryside, raised families, celebrated festivals, and hoped that tomorrow would be a little better than today. In many ways, they were not so different from us. That is what makes history so fascinating. It reminds us that although centuries pass, human nature changes very little. Ambition, hope, fear, pride, loyalty, and curiosity have always been part of the human story. The tale of Caligula is more than the story of one emperor. It is a reminder that power without wisdom can become dangerous, that fear can spread faster than truth, and that every ruler, no matter how powerful, will one day become part of the past. Empires rise, empires fall, but their stories continue to travel through time, waiting for new generations to discover them. Perhaps that is why ancient Rome still captures our imagination after nearly 2,000 years. Its buildings may have crumbled,
Its legions may have vanished, yet its lessons remain surprisingly alive. And with that, our quiet journey through the world of Rome comes to a close. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Until our next journey into the past, may the echoes of history gently fade into the night, and may you rest well.